Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the economy in Cuba. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that I've posted regularly on Cuba, and unfortunately, the situation isn't getting any better. In fact, it's probably getting worse. There are continued food and power shortages, and as a result of the removal of subsidies at the start of March, the price of gasoline and a lot of other products has risen dramatically, and this is putting real pressure onto a lot of Cubans because around 70% of their income is currently spent on food, which represents severe poverty. So in today's video, we'll talk about what's happening with food and power supplies. We'll have a look at what's going on with the sugar harvest, because sugar used to be a really key part of Cuba's GDP. Back at the start of the 20th century, Cuba was actually the biggest producer and exporter of sugar in the world. It was producing around 5 million tonnes per annum out of a global market of 25 million, so it represented around 20%. However, over the last 20 years or so, there has been a huge reduction in investment into the industry, and the harvest for 2024 isn't expected to be big enough to even satisfy the demand in Cuba. So Cuba may now have to start importing sugar. So this is a huge reversal. So we'll have a look at what's going on and what the problems are with the sugar industry and whether or not they can be sorted out. We'll also talk about what's happening with the peso, because the value is continuing to fall, and the Cuban authorities have recently come out and made accusations that the USA is making the situation worse. So we'll talk about what that's all about. We'll also talk about the fact that a lot of Cubans who have emigrated remit huge amounts of money back to Cuba, and this actually accounts for around 25% of Cuba's GDP right now. So it's a really important part of the economy. We'll talk about what's going on with Russia, because they've got a long-standing relationship with Cuba as a result of the fact that both nations have a communist background. So we'll talk about what's going on right now with Russia. We'll also talk about the move towards capitalism and the potential that this offers for the country going forward, because this is a glimmer of hope. There has actually been a lot of development in terms of people starting their own business over the last couple of years. So we'll have a look at that. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen in Cuba over the course of the next 3 to 6 months and what's likely to happen for their economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube Supe Thanks recently, thank you for that. Really, really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee membership or YouTube membership, thank you for that support. Really helps to keep me motivated, keeps me going, and keeps me posting more videos like this one. So thanks.
A crowd swarms a state-run market in Cuba's Santiago de Cuba, jostling for a chance at a once-monthly ration of government-subsidized chicken. But panic ensues as rumours of scarcity spread, and that's when the lights go out again. This is life here, this father of two explains. You live with no plan, basically. A dozen residents in Santiago neighbourhoods told Reuters of their frustration at food shortages and electricity outages that sometimes top 10 hours a day. A long-standing US trade embargo and related sanctions, as well as an inefficient state-run economy, have led to shortages of food, fuel and medicine, while Cuba's obsolete power plants cannot meet demand. The Caribbean outpost of Santiago is the former home of Fidel Castro and an area sympathetic to the 1959 communist revolution. But street vendors like Yoni Alberto Mena are becoming angry.
Imagine at 2 in the morning, a blackout. These children start sweating and itching, and it's when they feel hungry. It's annoying. They go to school in the morning not wanting to. They can't learn what is taught at school properly. This is primitive.
As a result of the power and food shortages, protests have recently broken out in Cuba.
President Miguel Diaz-Canel visited the area on Thursday and blamed the US and capitalist media for stoking protests.
This is a really interesting area because although in 2019 Cuba passed legislation allowing peaceful protests to take place for the first time, the law has never actually been approved. And so Cuban nationals are in a state of limbo in terms of technically they're allowed to do it, but actually the law doesn't say that they can. And so they run the risk of being arrested. It's been reported that after the most recent protests, around 12 people have been arrested and detained. And the outcome of what happens to them will be really interesting because protests took place in 2022 against the Cuban authorities. And it's now been announced that those individuals have been sentenced to between 10 and 15 years in prison. The Cuban government tried and found guilty 13 of those who participated in the 2022 protests, guilty of crimes ranging from sabotage to sedition. The majority of the penalties range from 10 to 15 years in prison, which the United States and several human rights groups have classified as heavy-handed. Brian Nichols, the US Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere, said on X, "The harsh sentencing this week of up to 15 years in prison for Cubans who peacefully assembled in Nuevitas in 2022 is outrageous. The Cuban government's continued repression of Cubans striving to fulfill their basic rights and needs is unconscionable." The Cuban government said that those it has jailed during island protests have been found guilty of other crimes, including public disobedience, vandalism and sedition, and deny human rights violations. The sanctions applied against Cuba by the USA remain in force, and as a result of this, Cuba is looking to redevelop its relationship with Russia. And this chart shows that since the war in Ukraine started in February 2022, Russia has significantly increased the amount of oil that it's delivering to Cuba. Now, so far in 2024, there's only been one recorded delivery, but it's likely that as we move forward, Russia will continue to supply Cuba with oil. The only question is how is Cuba going to pay for this oil, because it doesn't have any cash and therefore can't pay in dollars or any other currency. So it's likely that we've got an arrangement building here whereby Russia is building up some sort of debt arrangement with Cuba. Cuba will have to repay this at some point in the future, either when it comes into some cash, which I don't know when that's going to be, or through some other method. And it's also been reported that trade between Moscow and Havana is booming again, with around 100 Russian companies starting operations in Cuba over the past 12 months. And Russian tourism surged by 340% in 2023, more than any other nationality, aided in part by Cuba's rollout of the Mir payment card issued by Russia's central bank. And on the other side of the relationship, it's been reported that Russia has been recruiting Cuban nationals to fight in its army in Ukraine. Since launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has suffered heavy losses on the battlefield. No official figures are provided by Russia, but the current estimates from Ukraine are that around 500,000 Russians may have been killed so far in the war. Recruiting foreigners to replace some of those losses helps the Kremlin to avoid the risks posed by trying to mobilise Russians by force. And if you follow the channel, I'm sure you'll be aware that when the mobilisation was announced at the end of 2022, it was reported that around 700,000 Russians decided to emigrate to avoid being called up. Bringing Cuba into Russia is relatively straightforward, as the two countries have been allies since the Cold War, and Cubans do not need a visa to travel to Russia, and direct flights to Moscow make the trip easier. Lucrative army contracts offered by Russia appeal to Cuban men desperate to escape the worsening economic crisis, and documents leaked online suggest that Cuban men have been offered monthly payments in the region of $2,000, a huge sum in Cuba where the monthly salary is around $25. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Russia has been taking steps to make it significantly easier for foreigners to obtain Russian citizenship after spending time in the army. And reports suggest that Cuban fighters could receive Russian passports within months of signing up. And one of the benefits of this is that a Russian passport allows visa-free travel to 117 destinations, compared with only 61 for a Cuban passport. This graph plots the output of the Cuban sugar industry, between 1790 and 1960. And what this shows is that between 1820 and 1960, there was a continued increase in the output, rising from virtually nothing to more than 6 million tonnes per year by 1960. And the vast majority of the investment into the industry during this period was funded by US companies, because up until 1959, the USA was Cuba's largest trading partner. It's close geographically, and because of the climate, it was well suited for growing sugarcane, and as a result of that, American companies set up operations in Cuba to help develop the industry. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, between 1900 and 1960, Cuba was both the world's largest producer and exporter of sugar. This chart shows the annual volume of sugar production in Cuba between 1960 and 2022. And if we start off by looking at the period between 1960 and 1992, this represented the period where Cuba became very close with the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro and his Communist Party took over control of Cuba in 1959, and as a result of that, the economic ties with the USA were cut, and the USA imposed sanctions against Cuba, and so Cuba started working closely with the Soviet Union. And between 1960 and 1990, the Soviet Union took over the role previously provided by the USA of providing investment for the sugar industry, and in exchange for receiving large volumes of imported Cuban sugar, the Soviet Union provided discounted oil and gas to Cuba, and this helped to develop Cuba's infrastructure, and many of the power stations were constructed that used oil as their raw material. The Soviet Union was officially disbanded in December 1991, and you can see the devastating impact that this had on the Cuban sugar industry, because as a direct result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba no longer was receiving large investment into its sugar industry, and as a result of this, the output of the Cuban sugar industry fell from over 7 million tonnes in 1992 to around 4 million tonnes in 1993, and this fell further to 3 million by 1995. Around this time, Cuba started to develop its relationship with Venezuela, another country that has a communist background, and some investment did go back into the sugar industry, and over the next 7 years the output ranged between 3 and 4 million tonnes. However, the impact of the terrorist attacks in the USA on the 11th of September 2001 dealt a further blow to the sugar industry, as this led to a reduction in the level of tourism in Cuba, which meant that Cuba had less money and therefore it was unable to invest into the sugar industry, and so the harvest started to dwindle. And by 2005, the total output was down to around 1.5 million tonnes, which meant that Cuba was barely able to export any sugar because total demand in Cuba is around 1 million tonnes. Between 2005 and 2017, the Cuban authorities invested some money into the industry, and as you can see, the output started to increase and got back up to around 2 million tonnes per annum. However, in 2018, the output fell back to around 1 million as a result of the global slowdown in that year, which reduced the level of tourism again in Cuba. And Cuban tourism was further heavily impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and by 2022, the total harvest was down to around 750,000 tonnes. And it's now been revealed that the harvest for 2023 is expected to be around 650,000 tonnes, which is a further fall from the figure from 2022 and will actually be the lowest output that Cuba has achieved since 1900, so almost 125 years. And as I've just discussed, the demand in Cuba is around 1 million tonnes, so at 650,000, that means that Cuba needs to import around 350,000 tonnes just to satisfy its own demand. So this represents a double whammy from Cuba's point of view, because firstly, it doesn't have enough sugar to actually satisfy its own demand, so it's not going to be able to earn any income from exporting sugar, and secondly, it's going to have to pay for that extra 350,000 tonnes that it needs to feed its own population. But the situation is actually worse than that, because Cuba has a number of related associated businesses. One of the biggest exports from Cuba, aside from sugar, is its rum. It's famous for producing alcohol using its own sugarcane. And as a result of the fact that Cuba doesn't have enough sugar to feed its own population, the alcohol industry is now struggling to be able to access that sugar, and that sugar needs to come from Cuba in order for this to be classified as Cuban rum. If it uses imported sugar, then obviously that takes away from the provenance of the product. And there are also other industries such as the drinks industry and pharmaceuticals that rely upon large volumes of sugar being grown. So this is a real problem from Cuba's point of view and is going to make the economic problems in the country much worse. Another one of the major problems in Cuba is that the value of the Cuban peso has fallen significantly over the last few years. And if you're a worker who is paid by the state, then you are paid in Cuban pesos. However, the majority of the population prefer to deal in US dollars, and this is called dollarization. When you get to a situation where the people of a country lose faith in their own currency because it's diminishing in value on a daily basis, and so they prefer to get paid and to make payments using US dollars. This chart shows the movement in the official exchange rate between the US dollar and the Cuban peso over the last 10 years. And as you can see, there has only been one movement in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, $1 US was trading for 1 Cuban peso. However, at the start of 2021, the official exchange rate was changed to $1 US to 24 Cuban pesos. However, in Cuba, nobody is using the official rate, everybody is using the black market rate. And this chart shows the movement in the black market rate between the US dollar and the Cuban peso over the last 3 years. And what this shows is that 3 years ago, $1 US was trading for around 50 Cuban pesos. Today it's trading for around 375 pesos, which represents a fall of over 7 times over the last 3 years. And this is one of the reasons why Cubans do not want to be holding Cuban pesos and much rather prefer to hold US dollars. And interestingly, the Cuban authorities have indirectly accused the USA of undertaking financial terrorism against Cuba with regards to this black market rate. A Spanish language website called El Toque publishes the black market rate for the US dollar against the Cuban peso on a daily basis, and the Cuban state-run media outlet Cuba Debate recently stated that El Toque is secretly financed by the United States and establishes a false value of the peso in relation to the dollar. And it went on to say that this strategy was aimed at instigating large-scale protests in Cuba. As a result of the falling value of the peso, more and more people in Cuba want to use the US dollar. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, around 25% of the total GDP of Cuba is now made up by remittances of people who've moved overseas, sending money back to support their families. This chart shows the total value of overseas remittances back to Cuba between 2000 and 2023. And what this shows is that over this period, there has been a continued increase in the level of remittances that was only really impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Back in 2000, it was estimated that around $471 million was sent back to families from people working overseas. However, as you can see, by 2023, that figure has increased to $2.5 billion. And to make matters worse for a lot of Cubans, Western Union, which is the financial institution used by a lot of people to send money back home to Cuba, announced in February that it was suspending its transfer service to Cuba as a result of technical issues that were being experienced in Cuba itself. Now, Western Union have actually resumed the service. However, it caused major logistical problems for a lot of people that were looking to send money back to their family. As a result of the dire economic situation, in 2021, the Cuban authorities released the rules preventing people from setting up their own businesses. And it's been reported that over the last 3 years, over 10,000 businesses have now been established by private individuals in Cuba. Examples of the businesses that have been established are a private grocery store in Havana, a toilet paper factory in Marianao, a furniture making business, a pizza restaurant, a Russian-themed restaurant and bar in Havana, a garden furniture business, and a nightclub and bar. As at the end of 2023, it's estimated that around 1.5 million people are now employed by private enterprises in Cuba, and this is a growing part of the economy. It's estimated to produce around $1 billion worth of revenue for Cuba, which represents somewhere in the region of 10% of the total GDP. And as this sector grows, it'll be really interesting to see whether or not the Cuban authorities continue to let it flourish, or if they want to clamp down on it and try to nationalize some of these businesses, because obviously that would kill the entrepreneurial spirit. But what we're seeing here is necessity really driving the situation. Because the situation is so dire right now, people need to do something, and you need people to be creative and come up with new ideas and new businesses. And that's what's starting to happen. And it will be interesting to see whether the authorities are prepared to carry on with this structure, or if they want to go back to their traditional socialist values and stop all of this. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening in Cuba is absolutely fascinating, and also we've been following this situation for the last couple of years, and what we're seeing is that it isn't really getting any better. In fact, it's probably getting worse. The food and power shortages are as a result of the fact that Cuba doesn't have any cash. It's a net importer. It doesn't have enough valuable reserves to be able to export things to earn all of the money to pay for everything that it needs to import. And so over the last 50 or 60 years, it's relied on friendships and partnerships. In the past, before 1960, it had a great trading relationship with the USA. It established lots of businesses, and there was heavy investment into Cuba by USA companies. However, when Fidel Castro took over the country, a lot of that industry was nationalized and taken over, and so all of the American companies left, and there were trade sanctions applied against Cuba. Now, during the Cold War period, Cuba got very close to Russia, and as a result of that relationship, it carried on doing really well. However, when the Soviet Union fell apart at the start of the 1990s, that was a major problem from Cuba's point of view because they lost that special relationship with Russia. Russia had its own problems to be dealing with and so couldn't help Cuba out. Cuba did manage to get some support from Venezuela for a period of time, but obviously Venezuela now has its own problems as a result of the sanctions that have been applied against it by the USA. So the overall situation for Cuba right now is terrible in terms of it needs cash and it needs oil in order to produce electricity, because as a result of the friendship with Russia through the 60s and 70s, the power stations that were constructed were built to use oil because Cuba was receiving huge quantities of it from Russia at highly discounted rates. Obviously now that relationship isn't quite the same. So Cuba needs to buy in oil, and obviously oil is hugely expensive. It can't afford to buy in enough to produce the electricity, and that's why they were seeing blackouts. And when you have a situation where there are blackouts in a country, that is hugely problematic for all of the companies in that country, because if you don't have enough power to actually switch on all of your machinery and make things, then you're not going to make any money, and therefore you're not going to make a profit. The situation in Cuba is made worse by the fact that everything is run by the state, and the state isn't running things particularly well. So what we've talked about in today's video is the power and food shortages continuing. There have now been some protests, limited protests and peaceful protests. However, people have been arrested, and the previous batch of people that were arrested last year have been given between 10 and 15 years in jail, which the USA has said is a breach of their human rights and isn't going to help Cuba solving its sanctions problems with the USA anytime soon. And the other problems that we've talked about in today's video are the fact that the sugar industry, which was once one of the powerhouse industries in Cuba, has now got to the point where it's not even producing enough sugar to feed its own population. It now has to import sugar to make up the shortfall. And this is a dire situation because the lack of cash that the sugar industry is earning means that there'll be even less investment going into it next year. So there'll be less fertilizer, there'll be less fuel available for the farmers, there'll be less people available because they can't afford to pay them. And that's only going to mean a reduced harvest next year. And so this is a really vicious circle. So the sugar industry in Cuba is not really going to be in a position to help solve the problem. And the peso value is continuing to fall on a daily basis. And the Cuban authorities are trying to blame this on the USA, saying that the website that's publishing the black market rate is making things worse. I don't really think that's a justified argument. So in terms of is there any hope on the horizon for Cuba? Well, I think it's got two options. The first one is to buddy up closer to Russia, to try to develop the relationship back to where it was in the 60s and 70s, maybe get lots of free oil from Russia to try to get all of its power stations up and running, to produce more electricity, to start producing more things to earn more money. But obviously that will come at a cost, and that cost is likely to be some sort of debt arrangement with Russia, and it's questionable whether or not Cuba would ever be able to pay that debt off. And one of the concerns, I think, from the USA's point of view, is that if Russia does build up a large amount of debt with Cuba, will it look to take some land? Will it look to start building things in Cuba, which is obviously around 100 miles from Florida? And this goes back to the Bay of Pigs incident in the 1960s, when the USA was very concerned that Russia was going to use Cuba to set up some sort of nuclear facilities. I don't think that's likely to happen any point in the near future, but there is of course a risk that Russia could try to use Cuba as some sort of leverage going forward if relations do deteriorate between the USA and Russia. The other situation that we've talked about in today's video is the increase in capitalism. Over the last few years, Cuba has loosened its controls. It's allowed people to set up their own businesses. And this part of society is now flourishing. We're seeing entrepreneurialism and businesses starting to be created. And there is a possibility that Cuba could move more towards a capitalist culture and try to develop its economy. But I guess that will then come down to a political decision. Is Cuba happy to do that, or does it want to go back to the old communist ideals and get closer to Russia? So the overall summary of today's video is that the situation in Cuba is still very bad. It remains critical, and unless Cuba gets a large influx of cash or free oil at some point in the near future, there isn't really much light at the end of the tunnel. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.